This is your host, Sharon Hill, with No Critics, Just Politics. We're having another discussion today on political philosophy, and today we're going to be talking about Lucas and Gramsci. Now, many Marxist revisionists tended towards anarchy, stressing the Hegelian and utopian elements of his theory. The Hungarian philosopher Lucas, for example, and the German-born American philosopher Marcuse, who fled Nazi Germany in 1934, won some following in the mid-20th century among those in revolt against both authoritarian people's democracy and the diffuse capitalism and the managerial welfare state. Lucas' History and Class Consciousness, a neo-Hegelian work, claims that only the intuition of the proletariat can properly apprehend the totality of history, but world revolution is contingent, not inevitable, and Marxism is an instrument, not a prediction. Lucas renounced his heresy after residence in the Soviet Union under Stalin, but he maintained influence through literary and dramatic criticism. After Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956, Lucas advocated peaceful coexistence and intellectual rather than political subversion. In 1963, The Meaning of Contemporary Realism, he again relates Marx to Hegel and to even Aristotle against the Stalinist claim that Marx had made a radical new departure. Lucas' neo-Marxist literary criticisms can be contentious, but his insights, strongly expressed, have appealed to those eager to salvage the more humane aspects of Marxism and to promote revolution, even against a modified capitalism and social democracy by intellectuals rather than political means. The Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci deployed a vivid rhetorical talent in attacking existing society. Gramsci was alarmed that the proletariat was being assimilated by the capitalist order. He took his stand on the already obsolete Marxist doctrine of a class war between bourgeois and the proletarian. He aimed to unmask the bourgeois ideal of liberty and to replace parliaments with implacable machines of workers' councils which would destroy the current social order through a dictatorship of the proletariat. Democracy, he wrote, is our worst enemy. We must be ready to fight it because it blurs the clear separation of classes. Not only would parliamentary democracy and established rule would be unmasked, but culture too would be transformed. A worker civilization with its great industrial large cities and tumultuous, intense life would create a new civilization with new poetry, art, drama, fashion, and language. Gramsci insisted that the old culture should be destroyed and that education should be wrenched from the grip of the ruling classes and the church. But this militant revolutionary was also a utopian. He turned brilliantly hostile to Stalin's regime, for he believed, like Engels, that the dictatorship of the worker state would wither away. We do not wish, he wrote, to freeze the dictatorship. Following world revolution, a classic society would emerge, and mankind would be free to master nature instead of being involved in class war. Gramsci was arrested by a fascist government of Benito Mussolini in 1926 and spent the next 11 years in prison. He died shortly after his release for medical care in 1937. We now move on to critical theory of political philosophy. Let's say critical theory of the broad-based Marxist-oriented approach to the study of society was first developed in 1920 by philosopher Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. They and other members of the Frankfurt School, as this group came to be called, fled Germany after the Nazis came to power in 1933. The institute was relocated to the Columbia University in the United States and remained there until 1949 when it was reestablished in Frankfurt. The most prominent representatives of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory for the mid-20th century were Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas. The question initially addressed by critical theorists was why the working classes in advanced capitalist countries were generally unmotivated to press for radical social change in their own interests. They attempt to develop a theory of capitalist social relations and to analyze the various forms of cultural and ideological oppression arising from them. They also undertook major studies of fascism and later of dictatorial communist regimes. After World War II, during the era of the Cold War, critical theorists viewed the world as divided between two inherently oppressive models of social development. In these historical circumstances, questions concerning human liberation, what it consists of, and how it can be attained seem especially urgent. In Dialectics of Enlightenment, 1947, Horkheimer and Adorno argued that the celebration of reason by thinkers of the 18th century Enlightenment had led to the development of technologies sophisticated but oppressive and inhumane modes of governance, and was exemplified by the 20th century by fascism and totalitarianism. In works published in 1950s and the 60s, Marcuse attacked both the ideological conformism of managerial capitalism and the bureaucratic oppressions of the Communist People's Democracy. In his best known and most influential work, One-Dimensional Man, Studies in the Ideology of Advanced Industrial Society, 1964, he argued that the modern capitalist affluent society oppresses even those who are successful within while maintaining the complacency through the satisfaction of consumer culture. By cultivating such shallow forms of experience and by blocking critical understanding of the real workings of the system, the affluent society condemns its members to a one-dimensional existence of intellectual and spiritual poverty. In later works, Seeing Human Freedom as Everywhere in Retreat, Marcuse transferred the redeeming missions of the proletariat to a relative fringe of radical minorities, including the United States, the student, New Left, and militant groups such as the Black Panther Party. Critical theorists initially believed they could liberate people from false beliefs or false consciousness, and in particular ideologies that serve to maintain the political and economic status quo, but point out to them that they had acquired these beliefs in irrational ways through indoctrination. In the end, however, theorists, notably Marcuse, wonder whether the forces tending to promote ideology conformity in modern capitalist society has so compromised the perceptions and reasoning powers of most individuals that no rational critique would ever be effective. Okay, this is your host, Sharon Hill, No Critics, Just Politics. We're going to start right here and take a station break. Thank you.
¿Qué tal, mi gente? This your girl, Albina Nefertari, de su Algo Nuevo Radio. Si se busca de un nuevo y innovativo programa de radio, su algonuevo.com will be you the best in soca latina, banda, salsa, reggaeton y más. De rienda suelta la artista en ti. Unleash that artist within you. Much love from NoCriticsJustArtists.com, NoCriticsJustPolitics.com y sualgonuevo.com. Peace.
Okay, this is Sharon Hill, your host with No Critics, Just Politics. I'm returning back with our discussion on political philosophy. We're talking about Habermas. Now, in the works published from 1960, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas attempted to expand the scope of critical theory by incorporating ideas from contemporary analytical philosophy. In particular, the speech act theory developed by J.L. Huston and his student John Sear. Habermas argued that human beings have a fundamental interest in coming to agreement with each other in open, rational dialogue. He also held that in ordinary speech situations, people commit themselves to the truth of the assertions they make. In particular, they implicitly claim that assertions can be vindicated in an ideal speech situation. A dialogue that is completely free and uncoerced, in which no force prevails but that of the better argument. Now, the notion of an ideal speech situation suggests a certain approach to politics as well, assuming that correct political values and goals are those that everyone would agree to in an ideal speech situation. A political process that produces policies or laws on the basis of forms of communication that are less than ideal is to that extent suspect. The ideal of deliberative democracy is thus implicit in Habermas's ethical analysis of communication, and his own writings explicitly elaborate this point. According to this view, the aim of democratic politics should be to generate a conversation that leads to a rational consensus about the common good. Of course, the ideal by itself does not determine what particular laws or constitutional arrangements ought to exist in any specific society. In this sense, communicative ethics is formal and procedural rather than substantial. Philosophy can define the moral point of view, but it cannot dictate or predict what rational persons would agree to an ideal discussion aimed at truth. The development of liberal theory, logical positive interlude. Political and ethical philosophy in the English-speaking countries in the first half of the 20th century were inhibited to some extent by the advent of the early 1930s of logical positiveness, which conceived of knowledge claims on the model of the hypothesis of natural science. According to the simple version of logical positiveness, genuine knowledge claims can be divided into two groups: those that can be verified or falsified on the basis of observation or sense experience, which is an empirical claim, and two, those that are true or false simply by virtue of the conventional meanings assigned to the words they contain, along with their logical implication. All other claims, including the evaluative assertions made by traditional political and ethical philosophers, are literally meaningless, hence not worth discussing. A complementary view held by some logical positivists was the evaluative assertion. Properly understood, is not a statement of fact but either an expression of the speaker's attitude. A speech act aimed at influencing the behavior of others. This view of the language of ethical and political philosophy tended to limit serious study in these fields until 1960, when logical positiveness came to be regarded as simplistic as its conception of linguistic meaning and scientific practice. We're now going to move on to Rawls. Rawls, in his publication of The Theory of Justice, 1971, American philosopher John Rawls spurred a revival of interest of philosophical foundations of political liberalism. The viability of liberalism thereafter a major theme of political philosophy in English-speaking countries. According to the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, the liberalism is the conjunction of two ideas. One, individuals should have liberty of thought and speech and wide freedom to live their lives as they choose, so long as they do not harm others in certain ways. And two, individuals in any society should be able to determine through majority rule the laws by which they are governed, and should not be so unequal in status or wealth that they have unequal opportunities to participate in democratic decision making. Various traditional and modern versions of liberalism differ each other in their interpretation of these ideals and in the relative importance they assign to them. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls observed that a necessary condition of justice in any society that each individual should be the equal bearer of certain rights that cannot be disregarded under any circumstances, even if doing so would advance the general welfare or satisfy the demands of the majority.